Early, but I hope you don't mind going. Thank you for that. Thank you for being so accommodating.
Well, thank you for having us here tonight. And the reason that I had asked for some time on the agenda this evening is to discuss electromagnetic radiation and health. This is an issue that I initially brought.
Can I just stop you? 'Cause
Yes.
we all know you and we
Oh, I'm
appreciate you
sorry.
being here, but everybody may be watching on TV doesn't know who you are. So if you
Sure.
could just disclose. Thank you.
Cecilia Doucette, 31 Fatima Drive. I'm an Ashland resident, a former Town of Ashland employee. And 3 years ago, an electrical engineering friend of mine tipped me off that there could be biological effects from electromagnetic radiation. And it was news to me. It was at book group, so I kind of filed it away. And then it crossed my path again from another source. And I thought, if there's anything to this, I should investigate, because I used to run the Ashland Education Foundation. And in so doing, I ran 7 campaigns to bring technology into our schools. And then I went to work directly for the schools as our grant coordinator, and I helped all of our teachers, or a lot of our teachers, get wireless devices in their classrooms, from iPads to Chromebooks to Apple Minis to Apple TV and smart boards and a whole gamut of wireless technology. So I began to investigate, and I had checked with our IT director, and he at the time was not aware of any biological harm, but he looked into it and came back and said the FCC says it's fine. And then when Alan Graham left the district, I asked Paul Carpenter the same thing, and he hadn't heard of it before either. So as I began to investigate, and I came up with additional information from studies that have been done all over the world for decades, I began to filter that information off to our school administrators and our school committee. And they began to do their due diligence as well, and I was very, very grateful for their efforts. On the one hand, we have thousands of peer-reviewed, non-industry funded scientific studies. On the other hand, we have additional studies that would show no evidence of harm, and those are by and large funded by the industry of telecommunications, technology, and so forth. And so when our school committee got to the point of looking at the fine print that comes with each one of our mobile devices, in it there's a disclaimer buried very, very deeply in the fine print that says, do not keep this device anywhere on your body or you will exceed the FCC standards. And the FCC standards were set back in the 1990s. Influenced by data from the IEEE, or the Institute of Electronic and Electrical Engineers, not by scientists, not by medical doctors. So we were given standards back in the 90s based only on how much heat it would take to raise the temperature of the skin, and that's called the thermal effect. That's the only standard that we've ever had in our country for how much radiation can be emitted from all of these devices. And there was no testing done on children, there was no testing done on fetuses or the elderly or of people with already existing health conditions. And so back around 2007, a group of world scientists got together and recognized that this technology was initially developed for warfare. It comes out of our militaries from all over the world. And now that we had begun to deploy it commercially, they wanted to understand what that means. So they gathered up the research that had been done for decades already and said, this does look to be harmful, but we need to understand it better in the context that we're now using it in the commercial sector. So at that juncture, back in 2007, some countries said, okay, if there's evidence of harm, we're going to invoke the Precautionary Principle, which basically says if there's evidence of harm, you stop, you do the research, and once it's been proven safe, then you continue. But here in our country, we did not do that. And so they did more studies for 5 years, from 2007 through 2012, and not just a couple, but 1,800 new studies. And the large majority of those proved there was indeed biological harm. That was reported out in a very large document, I think it's like 1,400 pages, called the Bioinitiative Report. And in 2014, there was an executive summary put out for the public, which this board might like to begin examining. And so we have, in the last decade, I think all of us adopted Wi-Fi technology in our homes, in our schools, in our workplaces, in our public libraries, in our public buildings, without having any safety information to accompany those choices. And as we began to do the research in Ashland Public Schools, I spoke with our health agent, Mark Oram, who was very gracious to meet with me, and we talked about this, and he hadn't heard of it either, but he was generous enough to reach up to the state level to see what they might know. And he reached out to Dr. Bob Knorr at the Department of Public Health and the Environmental Division. And at that time, 3 years ago, Dr. Knorr wasn't very informed on this issue either. So Ashland Public Schools came out with what they called their best practices. And that says to keep the devices off of our bodies, off of our students and staff bodies, so that we're not setting microwave radiation on our bodies. They also said to turn off the Wi-Fi, meaning the routers and the access points, when not in use. And then they also said to turn off the devices, the actual devices, when not in use. And we have to understand that this radiation, it's not just about little Johnny sitting there with it in front of him. It's like a pebble in a pond, and it ripples out. So if you've got a classroom with 25 or 30 students who probably, in the upper grades, all have a cell phone with them, now they're all using an additional device in the classroom. Plus, we've got the access points up in the ceiling. That's an awful lot of microwave radiation that's coming at our students and staff. So the schools went ahead and rolled out their best practices. And what the scientists who actually have worked with this technology for years will tell us is that the only safe solution is to be hardwired. But I was grateful that our school committee did their due diligence and at least put some precautionary measures in place. I then went to meet with Senator Karen Spilka because, as Mr. Oram identified, there was no information that we could pass along from the state to help educate our community. So I met with Senator Spilka and showed her what we had learned here in Ashland and asked if there was a mechanism to help begin informing the public so that we would know about this and have a choice as to how we want to deploy our wireless or hardwired technologies. And so Senator Spilka's office crafted a bill that's Senate 1222, and it's to form a committee at the state level to start getting the right minds to the table to start looking at this, and then hopefully inform the public that this is biologically active and there are measures we can each take to lessen our exposure. So I was very thankful that Senator Spilka introduced that bill during this session that's just closed up. And I had heard from others, you know, don't get your hopes up because nothing ever happens to a bill the first time it's in session. But because an unusual chain of events happened, we had an expert panel of world scientists and technologists come to Massachusetts last summer and speak to our legislature. And then they also held a public forum right here in Framingham that some folks in Ashland got to go to as well. And we had Dr. Deborah Davis, who's one of our nation's top scientists. She holds a Nobel Peace Prize co-laureate for her work in climate change. She was also one of the scientists responsible for getting cigarettes out of airplanes, and she's held top posts in our government. She taught us about the science and that it's biologically active, and we really need to protect especially children and fetuses. She brought with her Frank Clegg, who was the now retired president of Microsoft Canada. And Mr. Clegg, when he retired, pictured a nice cushy retirement. But having worked in the industry for 30 years, he knew there was something up with Wi-Fi, and he knew enough not to have it in his home, but he didn't really understand it all. So he sought out a dozen of the world's top scientists. And Mr. Clegg came back to North America and said, our standards are not safe. And he's been working up in Canada. He's formed a nonprofit called Canadians for Safe Technology, and he is now working with Parliament to begin working on solving the mysteries of why we have radiation exposure up to here, but biological harm way down here. Also at that forum was Dr. Catherine Steiner Adair, and she is a child psychologist, and she came to tell us that aside from the biological harm, our excessive use today of screen time is also doing a lot of psychological harm to ourselves and our children. And there was also a woman named Janet Newton whose husband was overexposed to microwave radiation, and she was here to talk about the fact that we have standards in place for protecting people who have to go up on our rooftops, like the HVAC guys, the AC guys, the elevator guys, and there should be protocols in place to protect them from the near-field exposures to all the antennas on the rooftops, and they're not actually being upheld by our government. And then the fifth and final gentleman who came to speak to our legislature was Dr. Rs Sharma, and Dr. Sharma is the gentleman in the Indian government who sets the standards, the recommendations for how much radiation can be exposed to the population. Their standards used to be up where ours are still today, and Canada's are still today, and Dr. Sharma brought their levels down by 90%. So it can be done, but the question is, who wants to wait until the years unfold like it did with tobacco or with asbestos before our government steps up and conclusively says, yes, this is carcinogenic? With tobacco, with asbestos, the science was done for decades, and it took a very long time for our government to actually come up and say that. There's a lot of politics that play. Harvard University put out a study last summer called Captured Agency, and Captured Agency is a 59-page report out of the Law School Center for Ethics that details how it is that our FCC has put our guidelines in place and in some ways suppressed evidence of harm, created doubt so that the public will continue to buy their products. Meanwhile, the science is mounting very greatly to say this is toxic. In fact, just last month, the National Toxicology Program, which publishes a document that I believe our Board of Health works with called the Report on Carcinogens, the 12th edition. I think there's actually a 13th edition that came out in 2013. But the National Toxicology Program tracks carcinogenic items, and their rodent report, they've actually done a series of studies using rats and mice, and they have done a first section on that, and because the evidence was so compelling that the radiation that came out of the cell phones is causing cancer in these rodents, and what happens in rodents happens to humans, and we also have epidemiological studies already done that showed the brain cancers, and there's heart cancers, there's salivary gland cancers, and so forth. So for our government to finally come out with a study that's saying, yes, this is carcinogenic, that leads me to ask for your help in figuring out how we can go ahead and inform the public that we need to take precautions around this. So in Ashland, when that panel came to the State House, they informed me that we are the first public school district in the nation to begin putting preliminary measures in place to protect our students and staff. So I get calls all the time from people all over the country saying, what advice do you have? Because we're working with our schools in our town too. So in addition to Ashland being the first with that initiative, we are also, from what I understand, the first to have held a 6-part series on Wi-Fi radiation or electromagnetic radiation and health. And I know a couple of you were gracious enough to come attend some of those screenings that we had in our library. And I thank you for that, for coming to get educated. We are also the first in the nation to have on loan an acoustometer, which is about a $400 scientific device that measures electromagnetic radiation. And this is something that every member of the Ashland community can borrow. The way it works, just real quickly, anything that goes into yellow is where people who have developed sensitivities to this are seeing symptoms. Anything that goes up into the red is where there's a whole lot of scientific research indicating biological harm. If there were no electromagnetic radiation in this room, we wouldn't see anything. We might just hear a little crackle, but I suspect we have some wireless devices as well as access points to our routers here. So these are items that we might want to think about. We might want to ask ourselves, you know, what do we see around us when we drive through our neighborhoods? Are we seeing cell towers mounted inside neighborhoods? And I used to think, okay, you know, I've heard cell towers are bad, but what I didn't understand, it's not the tower itself, it's the antennas that are mounted on it. And if, for example, you look down on Cedar Street, the water tower down there has been licensed somehow for antennas, and you look and you start counting. Every manufacturer has their own antennas up there. Some countries say, okay, you get to put one here and you get to put one here, but we don't have those kinds of precautions put in place. We're now putting them right in neighborhoods, so people may be feeling early symptoms of electrohypersensitivity. They might not be sleeping the way they used to sleep through the night. They might be getting headaches that they can't account for. They might be having tinnitus in the ears, which is the ringing. So if I could explain just for a moment biologically what our scientists are finding and why this is impacting us in such ways. Dr. Martin Paul has been looking at this, and he's discovering something's going wrong with the voltage-gated calcium channels, and I know Ms. Margulies might understand that with her nursing background. But we are biologically electrical beings, and we have cell-to-cell communication that happens all the time and by and large runs our body chemistry. When we're exposed to electromagnetic radiation, that compromises the cell membrane and causes a leakage at the voltage-gated calcium channels. That leakage causes a chemical reaction that produces peroxynitrite. Peroxynitrite is a really bad free radical that then goes in and gravitates toward wherever our individual weakest systems are. So that's the first thing biologically that happens with this technology. The second thing happens as part of our circadian rhythm, and when we sleep at night, our pineal gland in the brain is in charge of releasing melatonin in the wee hours of darkness. Melatonin goes in and helps to clean up things like free radicals and other, natural breakdowns of our cells and cleans everything up. Unfortunately, what's happening with the electromagnetic radiation is it sees it as the light energy form that is as it is. And so the pineal gland doesn't properly release the melatonin in the wee hours of darkness if we've got these electromagnetic fields surrounding us while we're sleeping. So those of you who know somebody with breast cancer might already know that those folks often have very low numbers in melatonin, and this could be part of the reason for that. The third thing that happens is in controlled medical settings, we are now using electromagnetic radiation to stimulate cell growth, to make bones grow, to make other tissues and organisms grow in our body in a good way. But that's in a controlled setting. And what we've come to adopt so rapidly is Wi-Fi technology in a very uncontrolled setting. And so all of the ubiquitous radiation that we're exposed to is also exacerbating the growth of cells that we don't necessarily want to be growing in our bodies. So I wanted to spend just a moment telling you what other towns outside of Ashland are doing. Framingham Board of Health Director Mike Hugo came to the forum last summer with the world experts, and he got up and spoke for about 10 minutes, and there's a really good video of him saying that he had worked with Dr. Deborah Davis years ago to try and keep cell towers at bay in Framingham. And he thought maybe Framingham might one day become the first East Coast town to start putting precautions in place. If you buy or lease a cell phone, instead of fine print buried where nobody's going to see it, put up a sign, give somebody a flyer that says, if you keep this cell phone in your bra or in your pocket or anywhere on your body, you will exceed FCC guidelines. So Mike Hugo and his wife Beverly is the chairwoman of the school committee there, and they've both been learning about this over the last year as well. Last week I had a conversation. A parent in Hopkinton had come to our film series here, and she has put me in touch with the IT director in the Hopkinton Public Schools because they would like to be able to start protecting their children as well. In Dover-Sherborne at the forum last summer at the State House, I met a large number of parents who have also been concerned about cell towers, and they stopped one from going in at the high school in Dover-Sherborne. In Southborough, after Ashland put our best practices into place, a parent reached out to me to thank me for the advocacy on that because her son has developed electrohypersensitivity and he was not going to be able to go to camps for the summer because the buildings that he would have gone to these camps in also had electromagnetic radiation. She was able to take Ashland's best practices and talk to the administrator at Southborough Public Schools, who was gracious enough to turn off the Wi-Fi in the area of the building that that child would be attending a camp. So he got to go and hang out with his friends and be just a regular little boy having fun in the summertime. Southborough also invited me to go speak with their Board of Health last fall. And after educating them on what this issue is, I was then invited to speak to a chapter of the public health nurses. And they were all very interested in learning about this. The public health nurse, Leslie Chamberlain, in Southborough went back and discussed it at length with the Southborough Board of Health, and they took a vote and voted to send a letter to the Southborough Public Schools to start beginning to educate about electrohypersensitivity and electromagnetic radiation. So we're seeing some activity. I've gotten calls from parents in Brookline and Pepperell, Natick, and even Leslie Givens, who used to serve on this board, has reached out to me because she's very in the know about this subject as well. At
Cece,
this, yeah,
Can I just stop you, because I want to,
sure.
I do want the board to be able to ask some questions, because
Okay.
I actually have some, but I also
Sure.
wanted you to be able to promote, you did a whole series on this for TV, too.
We did. WACA, thank you very much, was gracious enough to send resources to my home. And I took the acoustimeter around and showed what I was exposing my family to, and then simple steps that we can all take if we choose. And again, it's a right to know. If we choose, there are very easy things we can do to lessen our exposure. So that is available on WACA-TV. I also spoke with the the school committee last week, and I'll be meeting with them again tomorrow night.
Okay.
And there's some additional information there too. Okay.
But I really wanted, because we do have a public hearing that we have to honor at 7:30, but
Sure.
I wanted the board to ask some questions, because I, as a parent, have some questions.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for educating everybody, and then I did attend that session in the Ashland Library. Question that I have is that you talked about Dr. Sharma from India.
Yes.
He could reduce it, but there wasn't any objection from the industry for that?
Oh, sure. Sure.
And-
Once you get something in place, then you've got to do the legwork to have people start adhering to it. So that's where they are right now.
Okay, is that hurting the industry quite a bit in terms of their profits or not?
I don't know what the profits are, but as Frank Clegg from Microsoft Canada said, the industry can absolutely solve this. They can make technology that's actually safe, that will be faster and more affordable. They just need a push because they've been able to operate this way for so long. Why would they disrupt that profit model when nobody's given them a good reason to? So I trust that those situations will be resolved. I've seen that some cell towers have been taken down, and India has laws now that say you cannot put it on a school, you cannot put it on a church, you cannot put it in a neighborhood, you cannot put it in a senior citizen building, because we need to protect our citizens and especially our most vulnerable.
So your education should be mostly concentrated for the internal sources in the house as well as some of the specific public sources. That's what your aim.
Right. Ultimately, hopefully, we will not have the airborne exposure that we're all exposed to everywhere we go. So what we do is learn and decide for ourselves what can we do in the spaces that we actually have control over. One of the items that the Board of Health would be wise to look into is the utility smart meters. We're not officially part of the grid yet, but they're rolling out the grid in Worcester right now in a pilot program that's got astronomical cost overruns, and there are people out there who are electrohypersensitive who are testifying about the health implications. So if that pilot moves forward, we would be well advised to really learn about that, because once you put that device on our houses, it's going to be emitting electromagnetic radiation 24/7. So what folks can do is ask that we keep our analog meters or the older digital meters that are not yet tied to the grid, because if you have somebody living in that space, or heaven forbid in an apartment or a condo where there's a whole bank of them, and you live in that electromagnetic radiation all the time, the harm is going to be very
So
great.
we should aim at educating people and bring the
Yes.
awareness up. Thank you.
Thank you.
You have anything?
I was looking at the reference list that you have here.
Yes.
And excuse me, I did pull up myself because I was most interested in this one for 2016. It actually indicates that the comments at this site were just initial comments. They anticipate peer review, and the results from the study would be available toward the end of 2017. I look at all these other references, and I'm wondering, are there other references? Because, I mean, I am a evidence-based person.
Sure.
I look at the validity of studies. I've done that all my career. And a lot of these are reports or comments or that kind of thing.
Oh, the science is there. If you were to go
When I
out
looked
to,
at the CDC website and the Surgeon General's website, you know, that it's different than the FCC. The FCC is obviously an industry-based organization.
Sure.
I mean, I actually not very closely personally know him, but I know the Surgeon General, and he's a really upstanding kind of guy. So I really, you know, I look to them, and I don't see the same thing, and so I'm really, I question.
I know, and it is
the
confusing.
evidence.
Yeah, it is confusing. It is very challenging to sift through, because you will find evidence, as with our Surgeon General in 1964, finally held a press conference and said, tobacco is carcinogenic. The science had been done for decades, and I think that's where we are at this juncture today. If anybody has seen the movie Concussion that Will Smith is starring in right now, to talk about how we didn't know that all of the head trauma from football was causing concussions that later caused people to have very, very serious brain problems later in life. Same thing, they cite the tobacco industry playbook. They also show how the industries come after these scientists, discredit them, and try and suppress evidence of harm. So, but Ms. Margulies, if you go out to the National Institutes of Health database and you type in electromagnetic radiation, harmful effects, you will see thousands of studies. And the one set of studies that really got me on my feet were the sperm studies and reproductive. They have taken sperm, male human sperm, and exposed it to the electromagnetic radiation from a laptop. It changed the DNA, it slowed the motility of the sperm, and it caused far fewer sperm to be viable in just 4 hours. Now, the gentlemen in the room are lucky they can reproduce more sperm, but the women in the room are not. We're born with all 30,000 eggs, and if we're not being very judicious about how we use our technology, we could be doing a lot. And I know Dr. Martha Herbert over at Mass General has an autism lab, and she's finding a lot of linkage to autism and electromagnetic radiation, along with the other environmental toxins that we're all dealing with. So the science is there, and I would be happy to sit down with you at a computer and pull it up. But if you go to my research repository, which I believe is the bottom link on that sheet you're referencing, there's a lot of the science in there.
The National Institute of Health is basically a database.
Yeah.
So it really does include studies of all sorts of quality and content. So when I did attend that presentation, I still left with a lot of questions, and
Yeah.
more questions.
And there are,
more
because
questions rather than answers. So I didn't come to those conclusions. It's not that there may not be conclusions. And when one compares it to tobacco or anything else, I really have to wonder, you know, we know now that vaccinations pretty much, you know, like the data really is there, that what people had believed were problems with vaccinations don't actually prove out in the science. So I think when we talk about comparisons with other industries, whether it's tobacco, vaccinations, global warming, you know, there's been a lot of naysayers and positive people on all sorts of topics, where it really does take those longitudinal studies, especially when we're talking about cancer.
right, but do we want to
Because-
take the risk of exposing our children and our fetuses to this while all of the full science plays out? I think it comes back to a right-to-know issue, and those who would like to know about this can be
Yep.
taught the precautionary
Sure.
measures to take.
Sure, absolutely.
And we have 221 world scientists who work with electromagnetic radiation, who have sent a formal appeal to the World Health Organization, to the United Nations, and all of its member states in the environmental branch, saying this is becoming an epidemic and we need to do something about it now. So there will always be conflicting science. That's what science is. You'll always have both sides of it. But this is one area where the scientists who work with this toxin are saying, don't wait.
Thank you. You made a wonderful presentation. Your presentation skills should be commended. You did a great job.
Thank you.
you hit home with me on this subject because, as you know, my oldest son is autistic, high-functioning autistic. But heck, it had to be 15 years ago when his pediatrician said, "Hey, let's get him tested for metals." What are you talking about, metals? Well, I don't understand what you're talking about. And the doctor kind of explained that with cell phone technology, and this is the part that I want to kind of drill down on, it's more the cell phone technology than necessarily the Wi-Fi technology, the metals. And when we had my oldest son tested, he tested off the charts for metals. And even today, you smell his hair, and it kind of smells like metal a little bit.
Yeah.
So much because I'm a father of an autistic child, I've become an expert on autism. We talked about vaccinations. Do vaccinations cause autism? Does cell phone technology cause autism? I'm kind of intrigued by, there's no data proof, but I believe, because my two boys are 16 months apart, they, same mother, same family, same household, same food, is that it is the metals and it is the environment, and that maybe cell phones don't cause it, but they cause something in the environment. Do you have any data to back that
Mr.
up?
Featherston, I think what you're referring to is that electromagnetic radiation amplifies around metal.
Okay.
So whether it's our glasses, piercings, the underwire in our brassieres, it amplifies metal. And when we have a toxic load already on our systems, adding the additional burden of cell phones, and I think 15 years ago when you first spoke to your pediatrician, cell phones were the #1 thing that people were starting to have. Today it's all electromagnetic radiation from all of our devices. And I think that's one of the dots that's not being connected in the media, because people hear cell phones, but we don't even think to say, oh, my laptop runs off of this too. My iPod runs off of this too. My baby monitor runs off of this too. My gaming devices, all of the wearables that people are now putting on.
Well, I also wanted to talk about that, even in the town of Ashland. I remember when Mr. Hugo was trying to stop the cell phone tower that we put up on Fountain Street when I was
Right.
a selectman. But even our water meters are all now Wi-Fi technology. And you drive by, and that's how they read that your water's in your gas
Right, and
meters
for that
everything
3
like that.
seconds that they drive by our homes, it's emitting microwave radiation 24/7, 365 days a year. So we need to look at alternatives. We certainly have to update our infrastructure, and we certainly need to improve the way we're getting our basic services delivered. But wireless doesn't have to be part of the solution. There are other countries doing it in different ways. We can send that data fiber optically, but we need to be very careful with electromagnetic radiation.
Well, you did a wonderful presentation. I wish we had
Thank
more
you.
time. We would like to invite you back.
I would like to come
Can
back.
you,
Yeah,
this is a
because
great document.
I don't want this to just be doom and gloom. I
No.
would like to have another
Right.
opportunity to present solutions, and if I can be put on an agenda, I'll do my best to
Well,
do
I
some
appreciate
true
the way you
education.
framed it as,
Sure.
you put the information out there. You're not
Yeah.
saying it one way or the other. You let people decide, and I think
Right.
that's the best way to do
Right.
it. So
It'll
thank
be
you for doing
like
it.
tobacco, alcohol, drugs.
Don't give up, keep this
Keep it up.
alive.
Great
Thank you
job.
so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you for taking the time.